Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in England and Wales is finally about to begin its first public hearings today, in about 20 minutes or so, in fact, 2.5 years after it was set up. It's expected to take 5 years to complete, and it really is a far-reaching inquiry looking into historic child abuse in institutions like the Catholic Church and care homes. It begins today with an investigation of the appalling treatment of thousands of British children who were sent to Australia after the Second World War. Many were orphans with hopes of a new life. The BBC has been told the inquiry will hear new evidence about the scale of what went on and the claim that it was covered up. A key witness in the inquiry will be David Hill, the former head of the Australian broadcaster ABC. He was sent from Britain to Australia as a child to one of the schools run by the Fairbridge Society, a British charity. Our correspondent Tom Simons met him and took him back to the shipping port of Tilbury, where 58 years ago he left the UK for good.
We arrived here on a bleak April day. It was raining, it was getting dark early, and the ship dwarfed the pier, and we had never seen anything like it. We had been sold the idea that we were going to the land of milk and honey, that we came from a very poor family, as most of the child migrants did. And up to that point, they had bought us new wardrobes of clothes, and we were in the state cabin of the Stratheard with 5-course lunches and 6-course dinners. We were treated like royalty. We thought, well, we've signed up for the right scheme. And it wasn't until we reached Sydney that the thud of reality hit all of us. Our lovely wardrobes that we were given here in England were taken from us, and we were issued with hard work denim clothing. The kids were all running around in the middle of winter in barefoot on the farm. They looked terrible because the kids cut each other's hair. Those kids would have gone through life with nobody ever putting a warm arm around them, giving them comfort and nurturing and support and encouragement. They were the most vulnerable, they were the least protected, they were the most abused. I was luckier than them, and lucky of all, most of all, because my mum eventually followed us out. Those kids never saw their mums again. They thought the idea of being flogged in the middle of the night by a sadistic, drunken cottage mother with an ironing cord was the norm.
What is your estimate of the number of children affected by some form of sexual abuse?
I've put the figure at over 60% of the kids that went to Fairbridge were sexually abused.
60%?
60%, and I think if you look at the conditions that prevailed in the other child migrant institutions, I'd be staggered if the figure isn't equally high or even higher in some of the Catholic boys' homes in Western Australia.
People will say these were different times. We didn't know what we know now about child development. Things weren't managed well. Is that an excuse?
It's not an excuse. If you go back to the 1950s, the British government sent a fact-finding mission to Australia, and they report back, and the British government, using standards that prevailed in the 1950s, drew up what they called a blacklist and put Fairbridge Farm and other child migrant institutions on the blacklist, defined them as being unfit for children. The British government not only continued to approve children to be sent, but financially subsidised them going. I'm surprised how vulnerable it's made me feel.
What do you mean by that?
That it could happen. And to happen to the extent that it did.
This is an inquiry that has been quite bitterly condemned for failing to do anything, in the view of some people, for 2.5 years. This is the first time it will have public hearings about the subject you're so concerned about. What can it achieve?
From my point of view, only good can come of it, because the truth will be known. It seems to me that the greater the evil, the stronger the conspiracy to keep it a secret and keep it covered up. So if this inquiry is capable of opening some of that truth, then that's a good thing.
It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? Let's speak now to Clifford Walsh, who is a survivor who experienced sexual abuse when he was sent from London to live at a Catholic institution in a place called Bindoon in Australia. Also with us, Margaret Humphreys, the director of the Child Migrants Trust. She's dedicated her life to reuniting lost migrant children with their families. And Margaret, I know you're about to go into the inquiry, so I'll talk to you first, if I may, and Clifford, I'll be with you in just a moment. Tell us what work you have done to try to bring these former children back together with their families.
Well, good morning, Victoria. I mean, I think I'd like to say straight away that these children were not orphans at all. They had mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters. So that over the years has been part of the myth. They are not orphans. So just like to make that really clear to your viewers. We've spent 30 years bringing child migrants home to meet their mothers, their fathers, their families, their communities. In the early days, 25, 30 years ago, we used to bring one person home at a time. These were former child migrants who some left here when they were 4 or 5 years of age. And I think over the next few weeks, we are going to hear the most horrific stories of their times in these residential institutions overseas.
Even with orphans, it seems hard to justify this policy back then, but you're saying they weren't orphans, so what on earth was the rationale?
Well, I think this is hopefully what the inquiry is going to explore with people and look at the policy, look at what happened to families, to children, and particularly the emphasis on this really important inquiry. You know, it's taken us 30 years to get this inquiry. Some of those questions have to be answered.
I know you have to go, but I think I can ask one more question, Margaret, if I may. Can you give us some examples of the kind of cruelty that some of these children were subjected to?
Well, I perhaps can answer it best this way. This week we're going to hear from the child migrants. We're going to, for the first time in the history of child migration, and we've got a long history of treating our children like this, we're going to hear their voices for the first time. And I would just say, let's pause, let's just listen to them, just for a moment. We'll get an idea what happened to them, what happened to their families, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard for us to hear it, but we must listen, we must hear it, and we must learn the lessons.
Thank you for talking to us. Margaret Humphreys, Director of the Child Migrants Trust. That was founded in 1987. Clifford Walsh, thank you for joining us from Australia.
You're welcome.
You were told, I think, Clifford, that your parents were dead, but that wasn't true.
No, not at all. I had a mother. My father, of course, died in the war. And I went through life thinking that I had no parents. And it wasn't until Margaret Humphreys came on the scene that I found out I still had a mother. And I finally met her when I was 50.
Wow. You were 9 then when you stepped off the ship from London.
That's right.
What did you think was going on?
Well, I was basically looking forward to it because they made all these wonderful promises of how great things were in Australia. I was a bit naive because someone in England said that in Australia there was 100 sheep for every person. So when we got to the war, in Fremantle, I sort of half hoped I'd see 100 sheep waiting for me, but that didn't eventuate. I didn't realise they meant they only outnumbered us by 100 to 1. And we were quickly sent to 2 days quarantine, then ended up in Bindoon. And until this point, I had every faith in adults, but it quickly diminished after that. after I was flogged on the second day I was there, because myself and another boy couldn't carry a crowbar 3 miles in the desired time. It was just too heavy for us. And we were beaten within an inch of our lives. And then he sat us on his knee and said, I don't like to hit boys because it hurts me, you know. And a load of rubbish that was. Because I'm sure he enjoyed it, because I never saw a man beat children more than he did.
And this
And
was at a
severe.
Catholic institution where...
Yes, he was a Christian brother.
Right. And you were also sexually abused at that place as well?
At least 30 times.
Wow.
5 by one person and at least 25 by a person who was in charge of me for a few months. And it wasn't until he tried to rape me, or half succeeded in raping me, and I was screaming and so forth, and he put his old fellow in my mouth and ejaculated and left me gurgling and spluttering for about 25 minutes. That he let me out, and I went and saw the priest in charge. I won't mention his name, and I told him, who then reported it to the principal. The principal called me to his office, and he spoke so harshly to me, I thought I was in trouble, and I didn't dare say anything about this brother. So I said the priest must have misunderstood what I said, and that was the end of that. I was let go mercifully, because I thought I was in for another sound thrashing, and because I opened my mouth, I was shipped off to Norcia.
Right. Can I ask you, Clifford, what I mean, such horrors perpetrated against you as a boy, what impact does that have on you as you're growing up into adult life?
Well, for the first 11 years, I joined the Navy, and I was very much alone. I used to go ashore by myself. I wouldn't trust anybody, and even when I got married, I didn't like anybody to touch me, no one to put their arms around me, no one, male or female. And that still continues today. I don't want anybody to touch me, and I don't know how I managed to have children, because I didn't even like my wife to sit next to me, and I loved her dearly.
Yeah, it's a scandal that this independent inquiry into child sex abuse is going to explore and investigate. Do you think that 60 years on, it can get to the heart of why this decision was made to send thousands of British children abroad?
Well, it's got to come out, because we must see that this can never happen. Because in the 80s, they sent convicts out to Australia. But we didn't steal anything. We didn't commit any crime. Yet we were dumped in a hell that I honestly think was worse than the convicts had.
Clifford, thank you very much for talking to us. We appreciate your time and your openness. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Clifford Walsh. And the inquiry begins at just after 10:30. The reason it is beginning with this particular area, all these children, these British children who were sent abroad, apparently for a better life, is because some of those former child migrants are nearing the end of their lives, which is why they're starting the child sex abuse inquiry with this particular area. Pausing there, of course, to go live to the inquiry, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which is just about to begin. Here's the chair, Professor Alexis J.
The hearing will run for 9 days with one non-sitting day, finishing next Friday, 10th of March 2017. The case study into child migration programmes is a part of the inquiry's wider investigation into institutional failures in connection with the abuse of children outside of the United Kingdom. This is an important day for the work of the inquiry and for the core participants and witnesses taking part in this case study. Today marks not only the first day of this hearing on child migration programmes, but the opening of the first public hearing in which the inquiry will hear live and read evidence from complainants and their experiences of sexual abuse. As you all know, the task of the chair and panel of the inquiry is to examine the extent to which public and private institutions in England and Wales have failed to protect children from sexual abuse in the past, and for us to make meaningful recommendations to keep children safe today and in the future. The definition of scope of this case study was published on the inquiry website in May 2016. To fulfil our task, the inquiry will hold 2 hearings in the child migration case study during 2017. This hearing, known as the Part 1 hearing, will provide an introduction to the history of the child migration programmes and the institutions involved, and the nature of the allegations of sexual abuse that have been made by former child migrants. The Part 2 hearing will commence on the 10th of July 2017 and focus on whether institutions based in England and Wales took sufficient care to protect children in the migration programmes and the response of those institutions to the alleged sexual abuse of child migrants. The inquiry's broader programme of work was published in its December 2016 report. The 2 hearings and the child migration case study are part of a full timetable of substantive hearings and seminars in a number of the inquiry's investigations, which will be held in 2017 and into 2018. As part of this case study, as in all investigations, the inquiry continues to receive and review very large volumes of evidence relating to sexual abuse and institutional responses to it, and you will hear more detail on the evidence shortly from Council. To all the core participants and their legal teams, we thank you for the hard work you've done in preparing for this hearing and for the ongoing work involved in this case study. To the former child migrants who will give evidence before the inquiry during these hearings, and to those who have given written testimony, we are grateful for your courage in coming forward to bear witness. We are conscious of the great challenges that many of you have encountered as a result of your experiences as children. I want to assure you of the high priority that the inquiry places on this case study and on hearing your experiences. We thank those of you who have travelled long distances in order to testify before us. I would now like to introduce the core participants and, where appropriate, their representatives as follows. Counsel for the Child Migrants Trust, Ms. Aswini Weeraratne, QC. Counsel for core participant, Mr. Oliver Cosgrove, formerly known as G7, Mr. Imran Khan. Core participant, Mr. David Hill. Counsel for Bernardo's, Mr. Stephen Ford, QC. Counsel for the Sisters of Nazareth, Mr. Bilal Rawat. Counsel for the Catholic Council for IICSA, Ms. Kate Gallifant, QC. And Counsel for the Secretary of State for Health, Ms. Samantha Leake, QC. Good morning to everybody and welcome to this hearing. Before we hear from Council, a couple of points on practical arrangements. We will sit each day from 10:30 a.m. except on the days we're hearing evidence by video link from the east coast of Australia, when we will start early at 8 a.m. Those days are day 6, which is the 7th of March, and day 7, which is the 8th of March. Ordinarily, we will take a 15-minute break at around 11:45 a.m. On days when we are sitting early, we may take an earlier break during the morning. We will break for lunch at 1, returning at 2, and we intend to sit until around 4 o'clock each day. By way of an agenda, we rely on the hearing timetable, which sets out the order in which witnesses will be called. The hearing transcript is recorded simultaneously on screens throughout the room and will be published at the end of each day on the inquiry website. Any directions arising from the day's hearing will also be published on the website. As you will hear in more detail from Council, there are anonymity arrangements in place for witnesses. Ciphering and redactions have also been used in relation to the evidence in accordance with the inquiry's redaction protocol and restriction order, both of which are available on the website. If there is any inadvertent breach of a restriction order, I will ask that the simultaneous recording be stopped momentarily so that the issue can be addressed as appropriate. I now invite leading counsel to the inquiry in relation to the case study on child migration programmes, Henrietta Hill QC, to address the panel. Please go ahead, Ms Hill.
Thank you, Chair, members of the panel. I appear today with Catherine O'Byrne, Junior Counsel for this case study. Mark Wazouf and Paul Livingston are also assisting with the work on this case study, but are not present at the hearing today. Chair, in opening the proceedings on behalf of the inquiry, I'd like to, first of all, explain the scope and purpose of the case study. Secondly, provide an overview of the child migration schemes. Thirdly, summarise the evidence we anticipate you will hear during the case study. And finally, remind everybody of some logistical issues in respect of the witnesses. Turning first to the scope and purpose of this case study. This case study, Chair, as you've said, is part of the inquiry's protection of children outside the UK investigation. That investigation seeks to explore the extent to which institutions and organisations based in England and Wales have taken seriously their responsibilities to protect children outside the United Kingdom from sexual abuse. The inquiry has decided to divide that broad investigation into a number of narrower case studies, of which this case study on the child migration programmes is the first. In summary, Chair, you and the panel will hear that the child migration programmes were large-scale schemes in which thousands of children, many of them vulnerable, poor, abandoned, illegitimate, or in the care of the state, were systematically and permanently migrated to remote parts of the British Empire by various institutions in England and Wales, and with the knowledge and approval of the British government. Many allegations of sexual abuse have been made by former child migrants. The scope of this case study is to investigate and establish, first, whether government departments, public authorities, private and/or charitable institutions based in England and Wales took sufficient care to protect those children involved in child migration programmes. Second, the extent to which those same bodies were aware, or should have been aware, of allegations of evidence or evidence of sexual abuse concerning those children, and whether appropriate steps were taken in response. And third, the adequacy of support and reparations that have been offered to individuals who suffered sexual abuse relating to their inclusion in child migration programmes. As you've indicated, Chair, the inquiry has recognised 7 core participants for this case study. The Child Migrants Trust, Oliver Cosgrove and David Hill, who are both former child migrants, Bernardo's, the Sisters of Nazareth, the Catholic Council for the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, and the Secretary of State for Health. It is understood, Chair, as you know, that the Secretary of State for Health will represent the interests of other government departments, such as the Home Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the Department of Education. As you've indicated, Chair, the inquiry seeks to meet its terms of reference by conducting 2 public hearings in this case study. A Part 1 hearing, intended to provide an introduction to the child migration programmes and what previous inquiries have established about the incidence of sexual abuse of child migrants, and to hear direct evidence from former child migrants of their experiences. And a Part 2 hearing, which will focus on the position of the institutions involved, in particular what steps they took to protect children, what they knew or should have known of the sexual abuse of child migrants, the adequacy of their responses, and the issue of support and reparations to former child migrants. Today is the first day of that Part 1 hearing. The Part 2 hearing will commence on the 10th of July 2017. Turning then to an overview of the child migration programmes. Chair, the child migration case study relates to an extraordinary and lengthy episode in the history of child welfare in England and Wales. Child migration programmes achieved a degree of public recognition in this country in 2010, when the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a formal apology to former child migrants. But there remains little public awareness of the full extent of these programmes, of how they were conducted, of their effects upon the children who were subject to them, and particularly of the allegations of sexual abuse related to them. Chair, it's estimated that you'll hear evidence that over 100,000 British children were sent abroad as subjects of the child migration programmes, mostly to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and what was then Southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe. We anticipate that you will hear that most British child migrants, around 90,000, were sent to Canada between 1869 and 1924. The focus of this case study is the post-war period, but it's recognised that child migration schemes had operated for a lengthy period before then. As to the period after 1945, we anticipate that you will hear from the experts that over 3,000 children were sent to Australia between 1947 and 1965, with a few thereafter until the early 1970s. Around 559 were sent to New Zealand between 1949 and 1953. 329 were sent to one institution in Canada between 1935 and 1948, and 276 were sent to Southern Rhodesia between 1946 and 1956. Chair, you'll hear evidence as to the rationales for the child migration schemes, which varied. You're likely to hear that both British and colonial governments regarded these programmes as carrying the perceived benefits of reducing the cost to the state of maintaining destitute children while meeting labour shortages in the colonies. Many of the organisations advanced a humanitarian rationale, i.e. that they were rescuing children from poor and unsuitable environments and providing them with new and better opportunities overseas. Child migration assisted in populating the empire with white Anglo-Saxon settlers. It is argued that it met religious concerns about safeguarding children's religious beliefs, and in some instances it sought to ensure that a particular religious denomination was well represented among the imperial settlers. As to the funding for child migration, Chair, you'll hear that initially the schemes were funded by a combination of charitable donations and funding from local poor law unions. However, the Empire Settlement Act of 1922 and those that followed provided that partial public funding was available for any approved migration scheme, including child migration, whether it was run by the government or by a voluntary organisation. Additional funding was often provided by national and regional governments overseas. According to the available records, Chair, children as young as 2 were migrated under these programmes. We anticipate that you will hear evidence that these children were put on board ships departing from England and Wales without being given any real understanding of where they were going, what they were doing, or why they were being sent. Many will say that they were taken without the consent or the informed consent of their parents or guardians. Many will say that they were wrongly told that they were orphans, separated from their siblings and deprived of basic details about their identities, making it much harder, if not impossible, to reunite themselves with their families in the future. In the receiving countries, most children were placed in institutions or in farm schools where they provided labour and domestic services, or with families. In those institutions or schools, child migrants have given evidence that they were frequently subjected to extremely harsh conditions, hard labour and physical abuse by those responsible for their welfare. In addition, there are allegations of widespread and systematic sexual abuse taking place in those institutions, or some of them. Some former child migrants have alleged they were subjected to sexual abuse prior to their migration in homes and other institutions in England and Wales. There is some evidence that you will hear of child migrants being sexually abused during the journey from England and Wales. Others have described sexual abuse in work environments to which they were sent as teenagers on leaving the institutions, and some have described sexual abuse in holiday placements from the institutions. You're likely to hear, Chair, very emotional accounts from former child migrants of the decades of pain their experiences have caused. In respect of the institutions involved, the UK government provided partial funding for child migration schemes, approved the residential institutions to receive child migrants, and was responsible for consenting to the migration of children sent from local authority care. Local authorities sent a relatively small proportion of children in their care overseas and had no regulatory role or oversight of the children sent by voluntary organisations. Overseas organisations had varying responsibilities for the guardianship, partial funding and monitoring of child migrants. It was voluntary organisations, including religious bodies, who oversaw the selection and transportation of many child migrants from their own residential homes or directly from their families. They sometimes worked with intermediary organisations to arrange migration. Voluntary organisations also often placed the children in residential homes overseas that were either part of the same organisation or an affiliate of it, or were part of the same religious denomination. Given the scope of the case study, Chair, the inquiry will not consider the role of overseas bodies in child migration in any detail, save to the extent that the same is necessary to understand the roles, responsibilities and response of those institutions based in England and Wales. In terms of the voluntary organisations involved, you will hear evidence from a selection of children who were migrated overseas by the Fairbridge Society, the Church of England Children's Society, Cornwall County Council, the Sisters of Nazareth, Southwark Catholic Rescue Society, the Royal Overseas League, the National Children's Home, Father Hudson Society and Middlemore Emigration Homes. It's not been possible to identify or call a witness who was migrated by every institution involved in the scheme, but you will hear from the experts an overview of the other institutions and organisations involved in selecting and migrating children. We anticipate, Chair, that the experts will opine that child migration schemes were never simply accepted practice of the day, but attracted criticism of their working methods as well as support. That there was increasing concern about these schemes from some parts of the UK government in the light of the childcare standards set out in the Curtis Report of 1946, and that these concerns formed part of the reasons why child migration schemes ultimately ended. Turning now briefly to the role of other inquiries and investigations. In 1998, the House of Commons Select Committee on Health investigated the issue of child migration. It found that the sexual abuse of child migrants in some institutions in Australia was widespread, systematic, and, to quote the language of their report, exceptionally depraved. The responsibility of some of the receiving institutions for the sexual abuse of children and the adequacy of reparations to former child migrants are currently being investigated by the Australian Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. The Australian Commission has carried out 3 case study investigations into institutions to which British child migrants were sent. It has found that at Salvation Army homes in Queensland and New South Wales, it had heard graphic and shocking accounts of how boys had been treated, that the homes were run in a highly regimented and authoritarian way, and that there was sexual abuse by officers or employees and from other boys resident in the home from 1956 until the closure of the homes. The Australian Royal Commission has also found that at Christian Brothers institutions in Australia, children were isolated, inadequately educated and sexually abused, and has found with regard to St Joseph's Orphanage that there was inadequate supervision, cruel and excessive punishment of the children there. The Commission has also found that some children had various barriers to reporting sexual abuse and that some who did complain were not believed or were punished. Very recently, in January of this year, the Northern Ireland Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry, which investigated children sent from institutions in Northern Ireland to Australia in the years after World War II, found numerous failures in respect of the Northern Irish government and various institutions that sent children to Australia. The Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry is also conducting an investigation into child migration. The United Kingdom government, through the 2010 apology, has acknowledged that children in child migration programmes endured the harshest of conditions, neglect and abuse, but made no specific mention of sexual abuse. To date, no public inquiry in the United Kingdom has undertaken a specific analysis of allegations of sexual abuse of child migrants and possible failings by institutions based in England and Wales in relation to that abuse. Previous reports and reviews on child migration have only considered sexual abuse in a limited way. The present case study, therefore, Chair, for the first time considers whether the various England and Wales bodies took sufficient care to protect children who were child migrants from sexual abuse, and whether after that abuse came to light there has been an adequate response. There is an added urgency to this case study given the advancing age and ill health of many of the former child migrants, a large number of whom have expressed a desire to assist the inquiry in its work. Turning then, Chair, to the evidence that you will hear in Part 1 and Part 2. Consistent with the scope of the Part 1 hearing, it's intended that the inquiry will hear evidence during this hearing from expert and factual witnesses about the history and context of the child migration programmes, as well as evidence from former child migrants themselves. We anticipate that the evidence will begin this afternoon with expert evidence on the child migration schemes from Professor Stephen Constantine and Professor Gordon Lynch, who've been instructed by the inquiry. On this occasion, they will provide evidence to assist in defining child migrants, as to the origins, motivations, development and funding of the schemes, and in broad terms, as to the criticisms of the scheme and the decline of the schemes. Then tomorrow, Chair, and for the remainder of the week, and for some of the days of next week, you'll hear evidence from a number of former child migrants, including Oliver Cosgrave and David Hill, who are core participants, as you know. This evidence is intended to give the inquiry a sense of the experiences of former child migrants.
This is Henrietta Hill, QC. She is counsel for the inquiry, talking about the decades of pain some of those who were abused as children have suffered. We're staying with the inquiry here on BBC.
Ought to be made available to them. She will give evidence about her work with former child migrants, the setting up of the Child Migrants Trust, or CMT, her understanding of the experience of child migrants, including of sexual abuse, the phenomenon of secondary abuse suffered by former child migrants, and the work and the principles of the CMT. We anticipate that on the final day of the Part 1 hearing, you'll hear further evidence from the experts on the issues of the structure and operation of the child migration schemes, the roles of central and local government and of voluntary organisations, and as to the organisational relationships in the schemes to the various countries in question. The experts will also summarise for you what previous inquiries and reports have found about child migration schemes and provide an overview of the available evidence in respect of the sexual abuse of child migrants. Turning then to the evidence in Part 2, just briefly. During the Part 2 hearing, Chair, the experts will give further evidence about the manner in which the consent of parents for migration was secured, the systems for the supervision and aftercare of child migrants, and the debates and grounds for concern about the schemes within voluntary organisations. It's during that hearing, Chair, that you and the panel will hear from representatives of the key institutions and organisations involved in the child migration programmes. We expect you will hear further evidence during Part 2 from Oliver Cosgrave and David Hill, and also from Dr. Humphreys, who will give further evidence about what she has described as early warnings and missed opportunities in respect to the schemes, as well as those witnesses' views on the institutional responses and other inquiries and redress mechanisms. The experts will also, in Part 2, provide more evidence about the reports of sexual abuse at several specific institutions, about the issues of knowledge and about the issues of response more generally. Turning then, Chair, briefly just to some logistical issues about the evidence. As you have said, it's anticipated that some evidence will be live, some will be read and some will be by video link. It's anticipated that Inquiry Counsel will conduct the majority of questioning of the witnesses who are here live or by video, but we will address you separately as appropriate if any core participant makes an application under Rule 10. Some evidence is being read to enable the inquiry to consider a broader range of evidence in a proportionate way. Some witness accounts are also being read because the witness is too unwell to give live evidence, or in one case, sadly, because the witness has passed away. We have circulated proposals for the evidence we intend to read, and any representations from the core participants will be taken into account. Professional support is being made available for each witness who gives evidence, as the inquiry fully recognises how difficult a task that is. There are restriction orders in place, as you have said, Chair, that protect the identities, names, addresses and images of any complainant core participant and any former child migrant witness. Some of the witnesses have specifically waived their right to anonymity, but for the remainder, the restriction orders must apply, and so we ask that they be referred to simply as A1, A2, etc. The material obtained for the case study has been redacted and ciphers applied where the inquiry considers it appropriate, in accordance with the inquiry's protocol on redaction. You, Chair, have directed already that the proceedings will be broadcast, which is likely to be particularly significant for this case study, given that many of those with a direct interest in it are now elderly, infirm or live abroad. For anonymous witnesses to whom the restriction orders apply, the court will be cleared and members of the press and public will only be able to follow the evidence from the annex. All that will be broadcast is the audio of the witness's voice. Chair, as you know, the broadcasting is subject to a 5-minute delay in case any issues over the restriction order, ciphering or redactions occur. And we ask for the assistance of all concerned in respecting those important processes and drawing to our attention promptly any issues that arise so that the broadcasting can be terminated and the matter resolved. If such an issue does arise, Chair, I propose to say the following. An issue has arisen as a result of which, Chair, I invite you to terminate the live broadcasting link and direct that there be no communication of the evidence given in the last 5 minutes. On resumption of the hearing, I'll invite you, Chair, in all likelihood to make a restriction order covering the evidence that was given inadvertently. So, Chair, that concludes all I wish to say in opening, and I invite you now, Chair, to hear opening statements from the other court participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Hill. Could I now invite Ms Weeraratne to make her opening statement?
Thank you, Chair. Members of the panel, I appear with Mr Yoshida, junior counsel in this for the CMT. Pardon me. I make this statement on behalf of the Child Migrants Trust or the CMT. This is a long overdue inquiry into child migration schemes operated and subsidised by the UK government in collaboration with voluntary agencies between 1946 and the early 1970s. I propose to offer some introductory remarks about the CMT, some context to the issues before this inquiry, and to highlight the evidence that will be given by the individual migrant witnesses. But first, I would like to say that the inquiry will hear that the government confirms that it does not seek to defend child migration policy or to underplay the consequences for the children involved or their families. It stands by the national apology made, as you've heard, by Prime Minister Gordon Brown in 2010, when he said that the former child migrants were let down and that in too many cases vulnerable children endured the harshest of conditions, neglect and abuse in the institutions that received them. This apology was welcomed by former child migrants and by the CMT. What followed was increased funding for the CMT, and a family restoration fund was established to help reunite the families. Yet it must be said that this national apology came 23 years after Dr. Margaret Humphreys of the CMT first raised the awareness of the horrors of child migration in 1987. The CMT has campaigned for a full judicial inquiry here in England into this shameful period in the UK's recent history. This has been denied, but through the CMT's persistence, the child migration scheme has been included in this inquiry because former child migrants were also sexually abused in the institutions either abroad or in the UK before they were sent. When the evidence of the former child migrants is heard, it will become clear why the CMT has campaigned for an inquiry that permits former child migrants, whether they allege sexual abuse or not, to tell their stories of appalling neglect and abuse, and to be heard here in England, in the country that deported them as small children, vulnerable children overseas so far from their families. The inquiry will hear that it remains of fundamental importance for those children, now adults, sent by government policy into experiences of abuse, loss of identity, loss of belonging, to have their voices heard and acknowledged in England, to have the British public share their sense of sorrow and outrage. They need to have their questions answered so far as is now possible, because there are still too many unanswered questions. We are where we are, as they say. Time is not on the side of former child migrants. One witness, A12, sadly died in December after preparing his evidence for this inquiry. And it appears that none of the institutions represented here are attempting to downplay the experiences of the former child migrants. The CMT remains committed to this inquiry and will offer its expertise to enable it to achieve useful outcomes and a lasting memorial to the experiences of former child migrants and the government's responsibility. One of the main questions for this inquiry we would submit is a forward-looking one. It is, how are we today to assist those who are abused to recover from their experiences? The answer to this question will flow from an examination of not only what happened many years ago to the individuals which is now, the inquiry will hear, well established by inquiries in Australia and most recently Northern Ireland, but also of what has happened since and how those responsible have responded on the road to these hearings. To understand Britain's response to child migration policy, the work of the CMT is centre stage. Through participation in public inquiries and media work, the CMT has played the leading role in highlighting and raising awareness of the terrible experiences of former child migrants since its foundation in 1987. This was acknowledged by the former Prime Minister in 2010 and by each inquiry into child migration in Australia and elsewhere. It functions through a small team of specialised social workers based in the UK and Australia, finding and reuniting families and assisting the delicate process of reclaiming the lost identities of former child migrants. The CMT has developed a unique expertise in this work, which it is anxious to share with this inquiry. The CMT is the only specialist independent social work agency to have pioneered professional services for all former British child migrants, a unique and special group of people. And it has reunited well over 1,000 former child migrants with their families. Dr. Margaret Humphreys, who will give evidence on behalf of the CMT in this part of the inquiries, is its founder and director. She has been much applauded and honoured for her work both in Australia and in Britain. The CMT established the International Association of Former Child Migrants and Their Families in 1997 as an association run by and for former child migrants and their families. The association has provided evidence to this inquiry, which will be heard in the second part, and pursues goals of recognition, justice and reparation for all former child migrants. In setting the context of this inquiry, we say there are 4 key points to make. The inquiry will hear there is good evidence that the UK government and agencies knew in the 1940s and 50s of the poor standards of care in Australian institutions and in some instances about sexual assaults also. Secondly, that the UK government failed to respond to stop child migration until it fizzled out in 1970. Third, that it took 50 years before this shameful history was scrutinised by a parliamentary committee in 1998, and now this public inquiry commencing nearly 70 years later. Fourth, that the fact of sexual abuse and the deplorable and abusive conditions these children lived in is now well established. Many British boys and girls were sent overseas by voluntary agencies. It is not controversial to state, Madam Chair, that only healthy white children were regarded as suitable child migrants intended to populate the empire. Migration was subsidised by taxpayers in the UK and Australia, and the evidence will show that voluntary agencies stood to gain financially and to obtain cheap labour into the bargain. This was not about truly voluntary migration, but forced or coerced deportation. The inquiry will hear that local authorities were not enthusiastic about the principle of child migration, and with 1 or 2 exceptions sent far fewer children overseas than voluntary agencies did. There was in effect a 2-tier system of childcare, depending on whether a child was in local authority care or not, with better standards being legislated for care in the UK. It is important to note that even in the early post-war period between 1946 and 1956, child migration was not without its critics or controversy, and migration to Canada had more or less ceased by this time. The inquiry will hear that there is clear evidence that the intention following the Curtis Report in 1946 was that the standard of care for deported children should be the same as that for children in the care in the UK under the Children Act 1948. Contemporary reports presented to the Home Office showed, however, that this was not the case. Deported children endured deplorable conditions that fell far short of acceptable standards even at that time, and many were sexually abused. There can be no valid argument that their treatment reflected the standards of the time. In 1956, the Ross fact-finding mission sent by the UK government was highly critical of the institutional character of many of the homes to which children were sent, and produced a confidential list of those that should be blacklisted. Yet the inquiry will hear that the UK government failed to legislate or issue regulations to protect children being sent by voluntary agencies to substandard institutions in Australia until 1982, a decade after the schemes had ended. In failing to do so, there is evidence that the inquiry will hear that the Home Office and the Commonwealth Relations Office bowed to political pressure exerted by prestigious and powerful sending institutions, for example, Fairbridge with royal patronage, and by the Australian Commonwealth Government with a mission to boost the post-war population of Australia with good white British stock. The inquiry will hear during these and later hearings that it was this lack of accountability and difference of approach, together with a lack of monitoring and aftercare once the children were deported, that allowed the voluntary agencies to drastically change the lives of thousands of children and their families, often in unintended ways. And it was not until 1998, 42 years after the Ross Report, that this matter was investigated by the Health Select Committee of the UK Parliament. The committee chair, David Hinchliffe MP, addressed Parliament in May 1999 and said, "This was one of the most shameful secrets of Britain's recent past." He said that it is about the deportation, in effect, of thousands of vulnerable children and young people from our care system. Our country washing its hands of responsibility for its citizens who, in many instances, had the appalling experiences as a direct consequence. But as you have heard, it was not until 2010, another 12 years later, that Prime Minister Gordon Brown made a formal apology on behalf of the government. Mr. Hinchliffe made two important points. He emphasised that this was not ancient history. Indeed, the last children were deported in 1970, which is within the lifetime of most MPs, dare I say it, the inquiry panel, and most of those present today. And he called it a shameful secret because until 1987 and the CMT, no one spoke of this scheme or inquired into its effects. Even so, today, child migration remains largely unknown to the general British public. And of course, the inquiry will hear that there is overwhelming evidence that has been accepted by the inquiries in Australia, by the Health Select Committee, and most recently in Northern Ireland, of abuse and assault, including sexual assault. And this inquiry, too, will hear that evidence. The Health Select Committee report in 1998.
You're watching BBC News on the opening day of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in England and Wales. In the last few minutes there, we've been listening to Counsel for the Child Migrants Trust outlining what the inquiry will be hearing for the next couple of weeks. That is the first stage of what, of course, is a very, very long inquiry indeed. Today, a hugely significant day, particularly, of course, for many, many survivors of abuse. This inquiry, set up several years ago, so long in the coming, and a lot of criticism, particularly in regards to its scope. But it is an important day for many. This at the start of a 5-year process. As I say, this inquiry covers events in England and Wales. There is, of course, a separate inquiry ongoing looking at abuse in children's homes in Scotland. That's been going since 2015. But this inquiry finally now, in the last hour, getting underway under its 4th chairwoman, Professor Alexis Jay, from whom we heard a little earlier and we will hear over the course of today and many, many weeks to come. She is the inquiry chair, but of course there have been 3 resignations before her, all adding to the difficulties, the difficult birth that this inquiry has had. I'm Jane Hill. We'll be here all day at this venue in central London where the inquiry is taking place, talking to some of those who may give evidence to this inquiry in the coming months and years, and to survivors of abuse as well, of course, for their views on the significance and the importance of what we will all be hearing and watching in the months and years to come.